everyone, I'm Tony Damien.
And I'm Andrew Rich, and welcome to the latest episode of Himalayan Bites.
Today we'll be talking about the Takeovers Panel. Often fun to read the adventures, the misadventures that people have when it's not you. It's okay if it is you and you win. Not so much if a bad decision has been made. But Andrew, what have we seen in the panel the last 6 months?
Yeah, well, Tony, it's been a very busy 6 months in the Takeovers Panel. We've seen a number of interesting matters come before the panel. We've seen quite a few about rights issues. So we've seen the Tempest, Ignite, Vintage, ERA, all heard before the panel. We've seen a particularly interesting development, though, and one I commend the panel on, which is their reforms to the standing arrangements. You will recall that anyone whose interests are affected has the right to apply to the panel. And the panel has taken the initiative to actually update its requirements to ensure that when you apply to the panel, you actually have to set out how your interests are affected. Now, why is that important? Well, we've seen a number of applicants over recent times where the shareholder may have only a handful of shares. The mere fact you own one share in a listed company or even a couple of shares shouldn't, of itself, all things being equal, mean that you should have the right to launch a panel application. And
on that, Andrew, good point, interesting point. When the panel was set up, turn of the century, the idea was to displace the tactical litigation that some people saw was happening in the courts. But the combination of one share, a couple of shares, plus rarely cost orders, it's a bit of a free kick. And sometimes I think there have been matters where you wonder, why are we spending the time on this?
That's absolutely right, Tony. We've seen the fact that you don't even need to brief lawyers to make a panel application. You just have to pay a relatively modest application fee. And critically, you are almost no chance of being subject to a cost order if you make an application. And that, personally, for me, is one reform I would like to see put on the agenda, which is an adverse cost orders being able to be made against unsuccessful applicants in appropriate cases.
Yeah, indeed.
We've also seen, you touched on, Tony, the fact that the panel was put in place to remove tactical litigation. We've actually seen the opposite of that, in my view. We've seen a proliferation of tactical litigation, and we've seen the panel overwhelmed in recent times. I think we've seen 13 or 14 applications in the last 3 months alone, which is tough for the panel with its very modest resources. So I do think there's more that can be done to improve the panel process. We're also seeing, as a result of things slowing down in the Takeovers Panel. The last statistic I saw, it was taking an average of 29 days between application and resolution of a panel matter. So some of the things we were trying to achieve back in 2000, reducing tactical litigation, improving speed of takeover decisions, we're actually seeing the opposite unfolding at the moment.
Interesting.
Tony, what else have you seen in the Takeovers Panel over the last first half of the year?
It's a bit like rights issues. They're always around, and they have been for since the panel was formed. Association is another issue that always seems to take up quite a bit of the panel's time, and that's no different. Lately, even last month, we had Sierra Rutile, we had Sequoia Financial, both association cases. The latter in the context of a board spill. There was a peaceful resolution there that everyone lived with. In Sierra, there were no proceedings commenced because the probative evidence needed, which can be tough on association, often you know it, but hard to prove. So we've seen some of those cases. We have also seen an interesting disclosure case in Pacific Smiles. So did the parties who had close to 20% interest disclose all they should have around that interest? And we all know the answer on those disclosure cases. You usually end up having to disclose more. The other thing Andrew mentioned is just on last month's cases, the range of outcomes. So we had a couple there. We had, as I mentioned, Sequoia. We also had the panel case, some say nothing else matters, Metallica Minerals. They weren't unforgiven, but they came to a peaceful resolution of their matter. We had some unacceptable circumstances, so in Pacific Smiles, for instance, and we also had a couple where the panel declined to commence proceedings. So I think a nice little illustration of the full range of remedies you can get there in the panel.
Yeah, and there was one other interesting decision a little earlier this year, which was the matter in the Takeovers Panel. Kin was making a takeover bid for Pact. There were some allegations that some of the disclosures that the bidder had put out there were a little too shorthand around delisting and the ability of the bidder to delist the target post-takeover. The full details of the delisting process were set out in the bidder's statement and repeated in the target statement. And the question arose, should the bidder have repeated all of the circumstances in which they can delist post-takeover bid, which is not easy. It's a pretty high bar if you don't get the number of target shareholders down to 150 who hold a marketable parcel. So really you're in a world where the way to delist is you have to wait a year before you can delist with a 75% vote, and that point of detail wasn't mentioned in the subsequent communications. Long story short, the panel accepted an undertaking for withdrawal rights and the matter was resolved. A couple of interesting points coming out of that decision. We saw a question about whether it was appropriate for email and text message communications in takeover matters. Fortunately, in my view, the panel and ASIC didn't suggest that texts and emails were inappropriate, which is a good thing, provided, of course, the messages in those communications are consistent with the disclosure documents. So a sensible outcome.
Yeah, and interesting on communications, perhaps straying from the panel to courts, as we know, just for the viewers, just referring to the fact that courts these days as well take quite a keen interest in schemes in the communications with shareholders of the scheme company. So it's an area of interest for everyone.
So as you can see, a very busy first half in the Takeovers Panel. Tony, what have we got in our next episode?
And in our next episode, very exciting viewers, we will be joined by a special guest. We are under NDA. We can't say who it is, but it will be very exciting. We'll see you then.